Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you a very tricky attacking game in which, well, it may be hard to calculate for you guys. It was hard to calculate for my opponent and me, but I hope that you can find the correct continuations in critical moments. I'm going to ask you to pause the videos. Now this is a very good example and a very good exercise in attacking chess. At least it was for me. Okay, so in round 6, I'm facing an 1800 rated opponent. Now, again, same as in round 3, my opponent's performance was much better than his rating, so I guess he is much stronger than 1800. I don't know by how much. Okay, and the opening was very interesting. After d4, d5, and bishop f4, we get the same exact position I had 2 rounds before this one, or in round 2, excuse me, so 4 rounds before this one. So after knight f6, e3, c5, my opponent plays the early queen to b6, and I played queen to b3, c4, queen to c2. This is all very normal. And in this position, my opponent made the same mistake my other opponent made in round 2. He played knight c6 before g6. Now, in this position, you want to occupy the h7, b1 diagonal with the bishop, but if you play bishop f5 now, white can just take it, and if you try to win the rook, you get mated. You therefore have to play either knight c6 or g6 first. If you play g6 first, then black is completely equal. After knight to d2 and bishop to f5, the queen retreats back to c1, and the knight comes out to c6. Okay, so that's theory. But if you make the mistake of playing knight c6 first, as was played in round 2, as well as in this game, then against knight c6, white plays knight to d2, and if g6 is played, I don't have to play queen c1 or knight to f3 or bishop to e2 or anything irrelevant for the position. I can just play pawn to e4. And now by force, I've prevented bishop to f5, and the bishop has no useful squares. Since the g4 square really isn't purposeful, I can just play pawn to h3, and the bishop has to retreat all the way back to d7. So, even though this is a mistake, it's still a playable position for black. In round 2, my opponent played pawn to e6 and got a losing position very early on after pawn to e5, knight to d7, where I just developed and then played a kingside attack. In this game, my opponent thought for a long time. I'm gonna say more than 20 minutes. Obviously, he was unfamiliar with this idea, and he was expecting to be able to play bishop to f5. And he found the only good continuation for black. So he actually played correctly in a very tough position. Taking with the pawn is a mistake, of course, because of knight c4. Taking with the knight is correct, and white takes. Bishop f5 here is not good because of pawn to f3. You do get your piece back, but eventually white is going to win the c4 pawn, have a broad center, have an attack, and so on and so on. So after knight e4, d4. Okay, in this position, white takes on c4. That's the whole point of why e4 is a good move. Black continues bishop to g7, and here there are 2 moves. You can play bishop e3 or knight to e2. I actually haven't been preparing this, and I made a mistake of not looking at the lines after they could have happened in round 2. So I didn't brush up on theory here, but I knew what I had to do. I just couldn't remember whether I should play bishop e3 or knight e2 first, but it leads to the same thing. It should be pointed out that queen e4 straight away simply doesn't work because of queen takes e2, and you have to play something like rook c1, and black should be at least equal, probably better. Okay, I played pawn to, bishop to e3. Now I'm threatening simply to play pawn to d5 and win the knight. So my opponent retreated to c7. And now I spent a long time thinking, because I know, or I knew, that you can take on e4, but I couldn't remember all the consequences. I knew that there were some tricky lines, which I just couldn't remember on the top of my head. And maybe I can get into trouble if I take here. So the main line in my mind was queen takes e4, bishop to f5, cutting off my queen, queen to f4, offering a queen trade. Now, if the queens are traded off, then white should be a clean pawn up with a nice center and nice development. Black does have the bishop pair, but a better bishop pair, I wanted to say, but that shouldn't amount to much. Of course, b5, b4 is an idea, but it's not quick enough. So black would have, I think, played e5. And after d5, knight e5, the bishop is attacked twice, and also black is threatening knight to d3, winning my queen. So bishop to b5. And after bishop to d7, there are a couple of options, either taking on d7 with check or playing queen to a4. After queen a4, knight d3 check is annoying, where I have to play king to f1. Now, of course, white is still a pawn up and should be better, but it's not clean. And the other option was bishop takes d7. And after queen d7, of course, still keeping the threat of knight d3, queen to e4, simply saving my queen. And after knight d3, black doesn't gain much, so probably castles queenside is a good idea. And then probably I'm forced to play bishop to d4. So that's what I was thinking if I take on e4 straight away. Of course, if I don't take on e4, then black would be able to play f5. But it weakens his position too much, and therefore I ended up playing knight to e2, which I knew had to be okay. I just couldn't decide whether to take on e4 or not. I decided not to. Okay, bishop to d7 was played, and in this position, since I'm free to castle, my knight has been developed, taking on e4 is actually a huge advantage for white. Now, I still didn't do it, and I'll try to explain why. Even though my move is going to seem absurd, my reasoning was flawed, firstly, because I was afraid of tactical weaknesses in my position, which cannot really be exploited. I was afraid of the loose bishop and of the prospect of ideas like knight e5 and knight to a5 and knight to b4 and so on. So I wanted to do something about that. If I take on e4, the same idea once again works much better in white's favor. After bishop to f5, queen to f4, e5, takes, knight takes, I can simply play bishop to b5, and if bishop to d7, I can take, queen takes, and I can castle. Obviously knight d3 now doesn't win the queen. So that's the point of playing knight e2 and then taking on e4. So this now is, it's not a winning position for white or anything, but white has a lead in development. The only good piece in black's position is the knight on e5. However, black is yet to castle, and white shouldn't have too many issues with the knight coming to d3. That being said, black would win a pawn straight away, but that wouldn't be a good idea. Okay, instead of that, I was looking for alternatives. I should mention that queen b3 simply doesn't work. Not because of knight a5, because you could then take on f7 with check and you get the d5 square, but because of e6. And my original idea was to go for this and then play bishop to f4, force the queen back to c8, and then play queen to c2. After which black plays f5, and I wasn't sure who's better and why, what's the position like. I was, to be honest, afraid of h6, g5, so I didn't go for that. The other option here, which was a serious candidate move, was just castles. And if knight a5, for example, then bishop to d5, and then f5 defending the pawn, simply knight to f4. Also bishop f4 is possible. Now this forces something to defend on e6, so queen d6 is the only move I can see. And then I was intending pawn to c4. Of course, calculating lines like this, in which your bishop can be trapped with, for example, e6. Obviously, when you see the position on the board, you can see c5, and you can see that white is okay. But it's hard to calculate, at least for me, because I'm afraid I'm going to miss something. So I didn't go for that either. So castles was a good option. Queen b3 was okay. Queen takes e4 was definitely the best move. What I played makes absolutely no sense. I played pawn to a3. Now, pawn to a3 is a bad move because it forces white to lose castling rights if black plays correctly. My opponent did play correctly. He played knight e5, and immediately white is worse. I did see this move, but I thought that I had to be better after bishop d5, which is absurd. Instead of a3, if I just castle, and he plays knight to e5, and I play bishop to d5, then knight d3 check is not possible, because if knight d3, I take the pawn. But after a3, knight e5, bishop to d5, he throws in knight d3, and that's what happened in the game. And of course, black is better here. The position is not lost for white or anything, but black is better. Both king d2 and king f1 are possible. I actually couldn't decide which one to go for, but I played king f1. When I looked at the game with the engine, it says king to d2 is slightly better, but not by much. It's about -1 for black, so a significant advantage, but not losing. And of course now f5, defending the pawn. That's the only logical follow-up. And in this position, I, believe it or not, made a losing mistake. After my next move, the engine says black is just winning, and with a precise attack should have no issues converting this position. It's obvious why. I mean, the pawns are marching forward, my bishop is kind of under attack and is going to be used as a tempo gain, maybe f3 later, maybe rook f8, the queen is coming into play, this bishop could come to h3 after the g pawn is gone. So I played pawn to g3, which seemed fairly sensible. I just want to prevent f4. And as I said, this is now -2.5. Black should be winning. I was not aware of that. I thought I was worse, but that, the position is complicated. It's not that the black king is too safe either. Cannot castle kingside. If castles queenside, my pieces look ready to attack. The engine line here, which I didn't consider at all, is queen to b3. And after f4, the engine wants to play bishop to d2. And now it gives two options for black. This position is completely equal, according to the engine, only slightly better for black. It gives bishop to c6 as the best move, and after bishop c6, bc6, white should play queen e6 with complete equality, threatening the pawn on e4. And the other option after bishop to d2 is pawn to f3, and after pawn to f3, white is better. The line doesn't go gf, but knight to g3, and after fg, king g, rook f8, knight takes e4. This should be not a clean pawn up, but a pawn up position for white. So that was the way to defend. I didn't consider queen b3. Now, for me at least, it's hard to understand moves that involve moving the queen when I'm afraid of being destroyed on the king side by a pawn storm and when my opponent has a knight on d3. When you analyze queen b3, it makes a ton of sense. Okay, so I played pawn to g3. Much worse, winning for black according to the engine. My opponent played e6, which is very precise, forcing my bishop back before playing e5. Okay, now there are two candidates. Queen b3, which I played, which should be about -4 for black. Or d5, which should be slightly better. After d5, bishop e5, white should continue pawn to f4, and after ef3, knight d4. Black is much better, no need to point that out, but the engine thinks this is better than what I did. Which, when you look at the game continuation, kind of makes sense. This pawn is sort of in the way of black's attack, and white is a pawn down, but maybe can regain this one. Also, if black gives up the bishop pair on d4, my bishop is going to be great, and also this knight is loose. What I did, to me, seemed like a good way to complicate the position. I knew I was worse, so I wanted to start a counterattack, so I played queen to b3. Queen to b3, firstly, threatens a queen trade if black castles queenside. So if castles queenside, I go queen c4, and maybe I can fight better in that position. I don't know. I do lose the b2 pawn, but not that I would have played queen c4, but I like having my queen have the option to go to c4 if my opponent castles queenside. Also, in some positions, I'm threatening to win the bishop. and the check on f7 could be annoying, or at least I thought so. That's not true. Okay, so here you can pause the video and try to continue the attack with black. This is, as I said, a very interesting position, and hopefully you will enjoy it. Take your time. I mean, this requires precision and calculation, so take your time, try to figure the position out, come up with the best continuation. Okay, after queen to b3, black is simply winning by force, and I think any strong player, any grandmaster, or needless to say, any computer engine would have won this position in about 5 moves. My opponent didn't play precisely. What happened in the game was rook to f8, which gives me the option to go bishop h6, which is not good from the engine perspective, but for humans, I thought I had an okay position. I mean, I knew I was worse again, but I thought I had fighting chances. Okay, so d5 after rook f8, bishop e5, and bishop to h6. Now, of course, he played rook f8 to prevent queen f7. Now the rook has to vacate the f8 square, or he has to give up the exchange. Of course, if rook f6, then bishop to g7. If rook f7, queen f7. So I thought this was kind of nice and complicated. So he castled queenside, which is correct. And I took the exchange. He took back. I played knight to d4. He took. I took. Okay, now I'm the exchange up. I'm still completely losing according to the engine, but I had no idea that I was losing here. Of course, the pawn storm seems nice, but I'm threatening queen c4, and if bishop c6, maybe d5. And you know, if I can develop my h1 rook, I'm an exchange up. Okay, let's go back to the position after queen to b3. Rook f8 is imprecise, and the position is about -2.5 after that, according to the engine. When I analyzed the position on my own, I found the winning continuation in about 10 minutes and managed to calculate everything correctly. And then later on, when I used the engine, it confirmed my analysis. I don't remember how much time my opponent had at this point, but it was definitely enough, definitely more than half an hour. Okay, so the correct way was just to continue the attack with pawn to f4. After pawn to f4, queen f7 check cannot be played. It's just a bad move because I cannot take the bishop. So there are two options, gf4 and queen f7. Let's look at the bad queen f7 first, because I think I would have played that. Okay, the king simply goes to d8. Now, if I take the bishop, I lose on the spot. Bishop to h3 check, king to g1, and queen takes g7. That we don't need to analyze that further. So, after queen to f7 check, king to d8, I can throw in gf4 first, because now my bishop is defending my queen still. And now bishop to h3 check again, king to g1, queen takes f7, bishop takes f7, and of course black's position is overwhelming. I just have no developed pieces and my position is just bad. This should be -3 for black. Okay, the other option, if I play the better gf4 instead of queen f7, is still very bad, very losing. Bishop h3 check, king to g1, and simply e takes f4. And whatever I do, I'm going to lose material or get mated. Of course, my king is completely cut off, so even something like f3 should suffice. f3, the knight moves, and then... No, excuse me, not f3. Yeah, but just getting the queen to the dark squares with, for example, queen to e7 after my bishop moves away. Okay, so this was the way to win the position. But my opponent played rook f8, and as I said, this is what happened. D, bishop e, bishop h6, castles, bishop f8, rook f8, knight d4, takes, takes. Okay, here he continued with pawn to f4, and at this point I was kind of happy with my position. Again, I knew there were probably winning chances for my opponent, and that probably he had some winning attacking options, and that I was worse. But I'm material up. I need a couple of moves to consolidate, and then if I can trade queens, I should be okay. If I can get my rook from h1 into the game, I should be okay. Okay, so I played queen to c4. offering a queen trade and making this bishop worse. If he declines the queen trade, then he has to play bishop c6, which means that there is no bishop h3. And without the bishop on h3, it's much harder for him to mate me. Okay, so this was step one. And then I played pawn to g4, which means that he cannot open up the position easily. Okay, and now, again, pause the video, try to continue the attack for black. Again, I had no idea during the game, but black is just winning. Try to find the winning continuation. It's not easy to find. This one is not easy. I didn't find it on my own. I found it when I analyzed the position with the engine. Okay, so the correct way to play is actually to go king to b8. Black is not in a hurry. You want to be able to move your pieces, and you want to be able to unpin. So, for example, pawn to h3. The engine gives this as the best move, but maybe there are some more human alternatives. Okay, but let's say pawn to h3. Now black simply continues f3. And I was looking at rook to d1, which seemed sensible, trying to give back the exchange. But now queen to f4. And let's say queen to c3. This is again an engine move which I don't understand, apart from the fact that the engine wants to play queen d2 and queen e3 to blockade. So let's say that's the idea. Now bishop to b5. What can I do? King g1 makes sense. That's the only move. Now knight to f2. And that's it. King f2. Rook to c8. The best move is to give up the queen. If you don't give up the queen, if you play queen to d2, then rook to c2. And if queen to c2, e3 check, king e1, queen g3, and that's game over. That's checkmate. Oh, queen f2 is the only move, and then queen f2 checkmate. So king b8 was a very, very powerful move. And this idea of bishop b5 and rook to c2 is just deadly. Of course, it's very hard to see all of that during a game. You wouldn't expect an 1800 player to find that, just the same as you wouldn't expect a 2000 rated player to defend against that, because it's indefensible. But yeah, he didn't find it. Instead, he just blundered. I don't know how much better he thought he was, but if you judge his opinion by his next move, even if he didn't blunder anything, I don't think he thought he was that much better, because he took on b2. Now, of course, this move just loses a piece. I can just play queen b4 and that's it. The game is over. Without the knight on d3, there is no attack, and obviously he cannot give up the rook with check, because I then get to trade queens as well. But even if I don't have queen b4, knight b2 is not a good move, because best case scenario, the knight goes back to d3 and they get to play rook b1 with counterplay. So yeah, but what happened in the game was queen b4, of course. I couldn't believe that he took on b2. He played queen to d8, I took the knight, queen to h4, and now bishop e6 check, king to b8. I could have played d5 here. Bishop b5 is not scary. d5, bishop b5, queen b5. If e3, I can just drop back to e2 with my queen. But instead I just played h3. I didn't want to allow queen h3 check. Of course, you think you have everything under control, but one check in conjunction with, let's say, f3 and then e3, you could still lose. After h3, I can never lose, because he simply doesn't have enough attackers in play. He played e3. Again, I can play d5, even though bishop b5 seems annoying, because now I cannot take it. If bishop b5, queen b5, then queen f2 mate. But I just go king to g1, and that's it. But instead of that, after e3, I played rook h2, which is even safer. Now there is absolutely nothing my opponent can do. So after queen f6, bishop to c4, rook d8, rook d1, he resigned. I've consolidated, and I'm basically threatening to go bishop to e2 and create a sort of fortress and eventually develop my rook with bishop e2, f3, king g2, rook h1, and rook e1, or rook c1, rook d1. So yeah, I mean, I didn't deserve to win this game, but if you saw what happened to me in round 3, this is sort of the opposite. I should have lost and I won. In round 3 I should have won, but I lost. So these things happen when bad players are playing. bad players, people who are not good enough to understand everything, which was me both in this game and in round 3, and here my opponent didn't find the most precise attacking moves. But yeah, I hope it was interesting. It was extremely interesting for me to analyze this game, to realize just how poorly I understood the dangers of the position. So I think you can learn a lot from this one. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.